in the 1920s and the 1930s, they basically closed down all the mosques, almost all the mosques and almost all the madrasas. In the 19th century and the early 20th century, they talk about this term called pan-Islamism. Pan-Islamism is this idea that the Muslim peoples are going to get together, use their collective power to counter colonial empire. The Soviets destroyed every single madrasa except for these two madrasas, and these two madrasas, Bukhari's Miri Arab Madrasa that I showed you earlier, and then an additional institution known as the Imam Bukhari Institute in Tashkent. These were literally the only two places that were allowed to operate. This is also the era in which you have Stalinism. Episode in Stalinism is known as the Great Terror, in which they kill tens of thousands of Muslim religious authorities. They're not just doing this to Muslims, they're doing this to Christians as well.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اهتدى بهديه واقتدى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد. Welcome everybody to the Project Ihya podcast for our episode 4 with our esteemed guest, Dr. Aria Nakissa. I want to thank him. He has been with us now for several episodes, for several hours, and we really appreciate it for gracing us with his time. So, alhamdulillah, just a short introduction once again for this episode. Dr. Aria Nakissa is a lecturer in the Faculty of Islamic Studies and Faculty of Social Sciences. He holds a joint PhD in Anthropology and Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard, a JD from Harvard Law School, and an MA in Islamic Law from the International Islamic University of Malaysia. Inshallah, today's episode is going to be on Islamic education. We're going to continue our series, and he's going to be covering with us Turkiye and Central Asia. But first, I just want to welcome him. Welcome, Dr. Aria Nakissa. I should have done that at the beginning. I usually do.
It's great to be back, and it's always an honor to participate. And I hope we can present the audience with something that will benefit them.
Alhamdulillah. So, inshallah, we're going to jump right into it. And what I'm going to do is share the slides here. And inshallah, I'm going to let you just take it from there. And last episode we did around the Middle East, and the discussion is now moving forward towards Turkey and Central Asia.
Yeah, so we are going ahead and we're looking at the transformation of Islamic education over the past 2 centuries in all of these different regions. We did Middle East and North Africa last session, and that's a particularly important region. It's a well-researched region. Now we're moving on to a region of Turkiye and Central Asia that is quite the opposite. It's a region that people don't know much about, but is very interesting nonetheless. And actually, one of the things which is so interesting about this region is historically in Islamic history, it's really been a center of Islamic scholarship, culture, art, and education. But during the modern period, there have been different forms of political repression that have really affected. The peoples of this region have really experienced a lot of coercive secularization, some of the most strict in the entire world. And this has led to the decline in influence of their Islamic institutions, including their Islamic educational institutions. But I mean, there's also, by the mid 20th century, the late 20th century, they also start coming back to some extent. So that will also be part of this story that we look at today. So,
I was just going to say, yeah, this is that one region where I think a lot of people they're curious about it, but there's not a lot known. I mean, you hear about, these scholars of what they call Mawara al-Nahar, and also, a lot of the scholars of the Ottoman Empire and things like that later on, obviously. But there's not a lot of knowledge about them, as you mentioned, when it comes to the Middle East, and that it's well researched and it's well documented. And I was going to ask you actually early on that why isn't it that people don't know, or there's just so little knowledge, I guess, in our shared experience regarding this part of the world. I don't want to say there isn't any, but I'm saying amongst the general masses, right? People don't really know much about you know uh, this region. So I think today's episode is going to be interesting, at least from that perspective, for everyone.
Yeah, I agree. So part of it is because the Islamic culture of this region is very much affected by some of these strict secularization campaigns. And then part of it is also because in the modern period, this region is cut up into a bunch of different states. And it can be confusing for people to understand how Turkiye is connected to Central Asia and some other regions, like let's say Southeastern Europe, let's say China. So one of the things that I'm going to do to help the audience understand that is to talk a little bit about how how Turkic populations fit together. And we can see this in the next slide. So all of these colored areas, whether we're talking about red, whether we're talking about green, whether we're talking about purple, these are peoples that are considered to be Turkic peoples. And you'll notice that some of them are in Southeastern Europe, although fewer today. This is kind of a map of them today. Fewer. One of the things that happens in the 19th and early 20th centuries is some of these people are actually driven out of Southeastern Europe. But basically, you have a number of peoples, Turkic peoples, that are settled from Southeastern Europe over here to the Anatolian Peninsula, and then the Caucasus, and then you have them in Central Asia and southwestern Russia, so the Volga-Urals region. And then you have them continuing on through Central Asia, all the way to Western China, like Xinjiang, for instance. So right now, most
By the way,
people
I
wouldn't.
don't. Sorry to interrupt. I don't know if they are you pointing at the map with your cursor. I don't know if everybody
Yeah,
can see
yeah.
that necessarily. I'm not really sure. I can see my cursor. Can you see mine?
Oh, I'm not sure that I can see your cursor. Maybe I can
Okay.
just point it out. So
Yeah.
if you look at this map from west to east, you can see different Turkic peoples, which are represented in kind of the different colors that are not gray. You can see a couple pieces of red in southeastern Europe. And then you see also the Anatolian Peninsula a little further west, and then you see the Caucasus. I'm sorry, a little further east, you see the Anatolian Peninsula, and then the Caucasus, and then Central Asia and southwestern Russia, and then kind of western China. So all of these regions that are colored are connected to each other in the sense that these are homes of Turkic populations. And you can call this set of lands, which extends basically from Anatolia or southeastern Europe in the west all the way to China in the east. You can call it Turkic Eurasia. So it's Eurasia, meaning it's Europe and Asia. And these are Turkic peoples who are living in this region. So Turkic Eurasia extends in the west from the Balkans, meaning Albania, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Kosovo, to Turkey, to the Caucasus, to southwestern Russia, like Crimea and the Volga-Ural regions, to Central Asia, meaning Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, to western China or Xinjiang. And when we talk about Turkic peoples, there are many different Turkic peoples. The most famous are the Turkish people who live in Anatolia. So when we talk about Turkey or Turkiye, we're talking about these Turkish people. But then there are also the Azerbaijanis and the Karachais of the Caucasus, the Tatars and Bashkirs of Russia, the Uzbeks, the Kyrgyz, the Turkmen, and the Kazakhs of Central Asia, and the Uyghurs and Salars of China. What is different. So when we talk about these different peoples are primarily differentiated by language. So they all speak Turkic languages. There's a Turkic language family. It consists of about 23 different related languages. They're similar in terms of vocabulary. They're similar in terms of grammar. They're part of the Altaic language family. And they're spoken by about 20 million or 200 million people spread across these regions. So when we talk about a particular Turkic people has its own language. So for instance, the Kazakh people speak the Kazakh language, which is a specific Turkic language. The Uzbek people speak the Uzbek language. The Kyrgyz people speak the Kyrgyz language. And then many of these have their own countries. So a country which has a lot of Uzbek speakers or Uzbeks is Uzbekistan. A country which has a lot of Kyrgyz people who are speaking the Kyrgyz language is Kyrgyzstan, for instance. These are Central Asian states. Now, the Turkic Muslim peoples have a close relationship to certain non-Turkic Muslim peoples that they lived besides, and they started sharing the same culture. So one of the things that all these Turkic Muslim peoples, they tend to have a specific form of Islam. Generally speaking, of course, there are exceptions, but generally speaking, most of them are Sunnis, Hanafis, Maturidi. They're very much inclined towards particular forms of Sufism, especially the Naqshbandi order. This is part of a culture that is shared. It's a shared cultural tradition that extends across Eurasia among these different Turkic peoples. And then there are certain non-Turkic peoples that have lived under governments run by Turkic peoples or right next door to Turkic peoples, and they've come to share their culture. So they've also become, like, let's say, Sunni, Hanafi, Maturidi, Naqshbandi. An example of a people that's non-Turkic but that had a lot of interaction with Turkic peoples and therefore shares its culture, like the Albanians and the Bosnians in Southeastern Europe. So they're not a Turkic people. They don't speak a Turkic language, but they lived under the Ottoman Empire, and for that reason share in this kind of Turkic culture. Or in the Caucasus, you can talk about the Chechens, you can talk about the Avars, you can talk about the English. People like Nurmagomedov.
Nurmagomedov.
Yeah, so this is an example. He's not Turkic. He doesn't come from a Turkic population himself, but the region that he's part of has been kind of shaped by this influence.
Would this also include people in, like, say, Afghans, for example, because they're also right on the border of the sort of Turkic region? Because I know at some point in Afghanistan it was Shafis. There was a lot of Shafis, from what I remember, predominantly, and then at some point it changes to Hanafi, Maturidi. I don't know. I guess I'm asking: is that influenced from the Turkic sort of, or is it the other way around?
I would have to look at the history of the region, but one very likely possibility is we're talking about parts of the region that are dominated by the Mughal Empire, maybe the Mughal Empire and its and later on the Deobandi movement of North India come to affect Afghanistan. And the Mughal Empire is a Turkic empire. It is a Turkic Mongol empire. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means later on. So I would say that in terms of explaining the spread of Hanafism in a Afghan context, it's very likely that it is tied to this history of interaction with the Mughal Empire and then later the Deobandi movement. So like the Taliban is linked to the Deobandi movement.
Yeah.
Okay. So how do these Turkic peoples of different types become Muslim? This process basically happens in the 8th century, and there are a number of different factors at play. So the Turkic people, initially, they're not spread across all these regions. They're not in the Middle East. They're not in Anatolia. They're not in Southeastern Europe. They're really concentrated originally in Central Asia. Central Asia is their homeland, and they're kind of nomads. They're steppe nomads in Central Asia. And one of the things that really distinguishes them is that they're very good at, they have a high level of skill in military matters. So they're very good with horses and swords and these other kind of implements of warfare. So for that reason, they become valuable as soldiers. They become, people want to recruit them into their armies. And this happens with the Muslim empire. So in the 8th century, the Umayyad and Abbasid empires, they cross over the Amu Darya River. This is a river in Uzbekistan. They cross over into Central Asia, and they basically expand their rule. They expand their empire into Central Asia. And when they expand their empire into Central Asia, they start coming into contact with these Turkic peoples. And these Turkic peoples, through their contact with the Umayyad and Abbasid empires, they start becoming Muslims. And many of them just become Muslims by being exposed to preaching, but a lot of them actually become join the military of the Umayyads and the Abbasids. So in the 9th century, the Abbasid Empire in particular becomes heavily or increasingly reliant on Turkic soldiers. And these Turkic soldiers, because they're so important to the government, they become kind of like a powerful political elite. So the Abbasid Caliphate itself is like an Arab caliphate, but the army is dominated, or the army has a very strong Turkic faction. And then eventually you also have a situation where, as the Turkic peoples start converting to Islam, through preaching and contact with the Umayyad and Abbasid empires, many of them actually start migrating. They start migrating into the Middle East. The tribes start migrating and resettling in the Middle East. So this is why you have an interesting situation where initially these Turkic peoples are concentrated in Central Asia, but then they start moving into the Middle East, and they start moving into the Anatolian Peninsula, and you kind of get a distribution that's closer to the population distribution that we have today. When these Turkic peoples get settled in the Middle East, and when they are used by these different initially Arab governments as soldiers, eventually they just start taking over the states. They just say, why do we even need to let anyone else rule? The top military commanders are Turkic already. They will just become the ruling sultans. And then basically from the 10th century onwards, they start forming these empires in the Middle East, in Central Asia, and so on. So two famous empires are like the Ghaznavid Empire, which lasts from the 10th to the 12th centuries, and then the Seljuk Empire, which lasts from the 11th century to the 12th century. These are examples of kind of famous Turkic empires that extend in the Middle East and Central Asia. Then you have a further complication in the 13th century. So as you are probably aware, in the 13th century, you have Genghis Khan, and you have the emergence of the Mongol Empire. So this happens in Mongolia. There's the Mongol Empire. The Mongols are originally non-Muslim, but they are very skilled soldiers. And they basically invade Central Asia and much of the Middle East. But ultimately, even though they invade Central Asia and much of the Middle East, their own culture doesn't become the dominant culture in this region. Instead, what happens is that they assimilate to the cultures that are found in Central Asia and the Middle East. So the general Muslim culture, or more specifically, the Turkic type Muslim culture. So by the 14th century, the Mongols begin to adopt Islam. They begin to adopt different Turkic norms, elements of Turkic culture. And this leads to a blending of the Turkic peoples and the Mongol people. So if you read about Islamic history, you'll hear the term Turco-Mongol. So you get kind of Turco-Mongol populations, Turco-Mongol empires. One of the very famous examples of this is the Timurid Empire, which lasts from the 14th century to the 16th century. It is headed by this famous figure named Timur, or in the West they call him Tamerlane. And then later on, this notion of Turkic and Turkic Mongol empires that have formed later give rise to the biggest empires that will dominate the Muslim world into the modern period. So basically, from the 16th century onwards, all of the major empires in the Muslim world, the most important empires, are all Turkic or Turkic Mongol. So one of them is the Ottoman Empire up until the early 20th century. Another is the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire is a Turkic Mongol empire, Turco-Mongol empire that lasts from the 16th century to the 19th century, obviously in the Indian subcontinent. A lesser known fact is that the empire in Persia is actually like a Turkic empire. So, for instance, the Qajar Empire that lasts from the 18th century into the early 20th century, this is another Turkic empire. So those are some things to keep in mind. Oftentimes people have this notion that maybe from the beginning of Islam, Arabs have dominated as the political elite, which is correct if you want to talk about the first century or so. So when you talk about the first century or two after the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you have a situation where, yeah, the Umayyad elite and the Abbasid elite, initially, these are kind of Arab political elites. But as their armies become, incorporate all of these Turks, basically Turks and Mongols or Turco-Mongol peoples come to rule the entire Muslim world from east to west. So that it's an interesting historical phenomenon. Oh, go ahead.
I guess somebody would ask a question. Sorry. I guess somebody would ask a question that what happens to the, I know this historically these the Turkic empires kind of take control. What happens to the Arab rule at
Well,
that
what
time?
happens is so this is an era before modern ethno-nationalism. And ultimately, what they have is they have a
Hmm.
shared Muslim identity. So let's say you have a country like Egypt, or you have the Arab world more generally. So into the modern period, the Arab world is dominated by the Ottoman Empire. So it's the Ottoman Empire that is ruling over Syria, ruling over Iraq, ruling at least nominally over Egypt, over Algeria, over Tunisia. These are all provinces of the Ottoman Empire. Now, someone might say, well, didn't the Arabs have a problem with these Ottomans? And I don't want to say that there weren't ethnic conflicts or tensions, but ultimately what they said is, well, the Ottomans are Muslims and they're ruling over us, and they are very competent. They are capable of defending our borders because they're very skilled in military matters. This is, in fact, how the Ottoman caliph would put himself forward. He would say, I'm the defender of Islam. If it weren't for me, if it weren't for my military generals, then in that case, we'd be overrun by, let's say, the European armies. Um, that obviously comes to change with the rise of modern nationalism in the 19th and 20th centuries, and like the Great Arab Revolt against the Ottomans, and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century. But that also is when in the Arab world, when you want to talk about the notion of Arab identity, pan-Arab identity, this is something which is kind of like a 19th and 20th century phenomenon. But before then, the primary entity that is binding everyone together is just the notion of being Muslim. So a common Islamic identity shared by the entire Ummah, and willingness to accept that Muslims of another ethnicity, if they have a particular skill, like let's say in military or political affairs, okay, as long as they have this skill, let it be used for the benefit of the overall ummah, even if it's a situation where, let's say, throughout the Middle East and North Africa, you have a situation where Turkic populations have comparatively more power than, let's say, Arab or Berber populations. So what can we say about these Turkic peoples? As I mentioned earlier, most of them are Sunni. They're tied to the Hanafi legal school, the Maturidi theological school, the Naqshbandi Sufi order. They also, interestingly enough, despite only, in addition to patronizing the Turkic language, they were really interested in Persian language and literature. And art, so they spent a lot of money kind of cultivating these arts as well. And then you have kind of hubs of art and culture and education under these Turkic peoples. So one is the land of Turkey, Turkiye today, so the Anatolian Peninsula, including Istanbul, and then Uzbekistan in Central Asia is also kind of a really important hub of Islamic education, but also learning and art more generally. So if you took a class on Islamic art, you'll find that many of the most important monuments, whether you're talking about madrasas, which are very beautiful, or palaces or mausoleums, so much of this is in Central Asia and Uzbekistan in particular. So,
What's the reason for the sorry? What's the reason for the Persian? Their sort of preference to
well,
Persian.
when the Turks first started, when they first started migrating into the Middle East, when they were migrating from Central Asia, Iran is closer to Central Asia than the Arab lands. So they started initially coming into
Mm.
contact with Iran and Iranian culture, and also the Mongols first started coming into contact with Iranian culture. So for that reason, both the Turks and the Mongols have a kind of leaning towards Persian language and literature and art, which is slightly different. Oftentimes, when you talk about Islamic history, people will talk about a Persianate version of Islam, which centers on texts written in Persian and some ideas, certain approaches to Islam, which are arguably maybe less strict and orthodox in certain ways, that is characteristic of certain lands. And this comes to be very important for the Turks and the Mongols, and actually also for India. So the Mughal Empire is like a Persianate empire, so kind of a Persian culture and language and thinkers become very important, and they will speak kind of, their elites will use the Persian language.
Yeah, I only asked that because, especially in our madrasa systems and things like that, in the subcontinent, Persian was like heavily. It's kind of waned off now, but it was like taught, and you learned that first, and then all your primary sort of subjects were taught in Persian. It's switched over to Urdu now, and now it's going, even switching over to other languages as well. Those primary books that you would normally study in the madrasa system, but there was always this sort of thing for Persian, as Persian was like the important language to know for a scholar,
Yeah,
and that's why I asked
absolutely. I mean,
the
the
question about that.
situation in South Asia under this is like a classic example of Persianate influence, like a Turco-Mongol elite.
Mm.
The Mongol Empire is a Turco-Mongol elite that is using the Persian in its administration and its art and its religious education. And some of these, and what you're when you're talking about how Persian was emphasized, that is a legacy of this Turco-Mongol government in South Asia. Okay, so one of the other interesting features about Turkic Eurasia, this region that is extending from, let's say, Anatolia to Central Asia and, southwestern Europe all the way to Western China, is this region is the most affected by secularism and kind of strong anti-religious government policy, sometimes called anti-clericalism. And this really is a phenomenon that intensifies between the 1920s and the 1940s. So this entire region, I don't know exactly why. There are different theories, but basically almost all of these Turkic populations are subject to very, very strong state-sponsored secularization policies. So in the 1920s, this starts happening in Turkey under Ataturk. It also starts happening in communist Russia. So Muslim populations under communist rule in Russia, some of them are, of course, within the borders of Russia today, like in the Caucasus or in the Volga-Ural region or Crimea. But in the 1920s, communist Russia is actually ruling over all of Central Asia. So they are also, Central Asia from the 1920s is really experiencing communist Soviet policies that are meant to transform the population into atheists. And then in the 1940s, you get this spread of these very strong anti-religious policies to Muslim populations in Southeastern Europe. So communist Albania, communist Yugoslavia. These are populations which are either Turkic or kind of have been affected by the overall culture of Turkic peoples. And then you have the same thing in communist China. So from the 1940s today, you have Muslims in China, like the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, or the Hui Muslims who are spread to other regions that have been subjected to some of these very intense secularization policies. And as a result, you have this really affects the religiosity of these people, and it also really reflects affects the nature of their religious institutions. So, oh, go ahead.
Not to be too no, sorry, but not to be too, what do you call it, conspiracy theorist, or go down that sort of hole. But how much water does that idea hold, that it's a lot of external influence, that because these people are basically like this bulwark, they're the of protecting, Islam and the Muslims. How much, like I said, how much water does that theory hold, that maybe it's like an external thing, that let's, if we break their religiosity, then we can, sort
Well,
of
there
subdue
was,
them.
without a doubt, I mean, not only the communist governments of Russia and China, but in addition to that, the European empires that were dominating other parts of the Muslim world, like the French and the British and the Dutch, all of them had this idea of breaking up the Muslim populations. So all of them were very keen on dissolving the Ottoman Empire. So the British, for instance, said,
Mhm.
okay, we want the Arabs to rise up against the Turks, and we want to kind of divide up the Ottoman Empire. That is important to keep these peoples weak. You also have a situation where communist Russia wants to make sure that the Turkic peoples in Central Asia that are under its rule, they're not traveling for Hajj. They're not traveling to the Muslim world. They're not interacting with other Muslims. So they will, for instance, ban travel. They'll ban books. They'll ban different types of cultural exchange that was characteristic of previous eras. The French colonial regime in North Africa and West Africa says we want to basically cordon off. We want to cordon off kind of black, they call it Islam noir, but black Muslim populations in West Africa. They say we don't want them interacting with Arabs. We don't want to see the spread of Arabic to these regions because they will talk about very explicitly in the 18th or in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, they talk about this term called pan-Islamism. Pan-Islamism is this idea that the Muslim peoples are going to get together and use their collective power to counter colonial empires. So kind of a very famous pan-Islamist figure is Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdu in his early career. They run a journal called Al-Urwa al-Wuthqa, which is basically a pan-Islamist journal. You also have the government. The late Ottoman Turkey has pan-Islamist policies. They're talking about all Muslims unifying together. And you have similar ideas with, let's say, Hizb ut-Tahrir, similar ideas with, types of the Muslim Brotherhood, certain branches of the Muslim Brotherhood. They have this idea of unifying. And this has always been seen as a undesirable political phenomenon and treated as such by these different empires. So one thing that you find among these Turkic peoples, and we can see it through statistics, is that their level of religiosity is the lowest of all of the different peoples of the Muslim world. So in terms of frequency of prayer, in terms of frequency of religious belief, in terms of support for, let's say, establishing an Islamic state or Sharia law, it's very, very low. So maybe if you ask these people, what percentage of you desire the application of Sharia law, maybe it's 10%, for instance. Whereas many other regions, it might be 30 or 40 or even 70%. Admitting that when these other populations talk about Sharia law, they don't really mean full traditional Sharia law, but basically what they mean is some significant aspect of some religious norms significantly shaping society and governance. So that desire is not as intense. It's actually quite a minority phenomenon among these Turkic peoples. Moreover, interpretations of Islam. So the extent to which they're willing to reform Islam is much more radical among these Turkic populations than outside of these Turkic regions. So when you start hearing about some of the ideas that they have, because other people, they say, oh, we want to reform Islam. So this is obviously a topic that we've discussed in previous episodes, but reforming Islam basically means creating a new interpretation of Islam, which is more in keeping with the liberal ideal of civilizational progress. So, we want to reinterpret the Quran and the Hadith so that it's more in keeping with science and it's more in keeping with liberal values of freedom and equality. It doesn't mean that you want to throw everything out, but it does mean that you're willing to challenge certain teachings. So maybe you say, oh yeah, the jinn mentioned in the Quran are actually microbes, are actually germs, or Islam doesn't really require, let's say, the implementation of the hudud because of changed social circumstances or maslahah. In these Turkic lands, they go much further than this. So, and we'll see some examples of this, but it's quite these populations are quite interested in radical breaks from the past. And actually, the person who pioneers this is Ataturk in Turkey in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. This is like a radical. Ataturk is very much known for political reform, but part of the political reform, a key aspect of political reform, is reforming Turkish understandings of Islam and doing that through reform of the educational institutions, which we'll look at in just a moment. So the two countries that are really central to this story that I want to tell about the transformation of religious education in Turkey and Central Asia are the country of Turkiye, and the country of Uzbekistan in Central Asia, because these are historically two of the most important hubs of Islamic education and scholarship and culture. And they come to really be transformed in the modern period. So let's start with Turkey. Turkey is the center of the Ottoman Empire. So here we have a slide of the Ottoman Empire. The headquarters of the Ottoman Empire is Istanbul. Istanbul is home, so under this Turkish Ottoman Empire, headquartered in Istanbul, they have a lot of very famous madrasas, Bayezid, the second madrasa in Edirne, the Karatai madrasa in Konya. Perhaps the two most important are the Suleymaniye madrasa and the Samaniye madrasa in Istanbul. These are not only the most important madrasas in Turkey, like the Anatolian Peninsula, they're two of the most important madrasas in all of the Muslim world. Now, since the mid-19th century, Turkey has been home to a lot of government-sponsored Islamic reform movements. So all of these Islamic reform movements say, yeah, we want to keep parts of Islam, but we also want to mix Islam or find some way of integrating our Islamic tradition with the liberal ideal of civilizational progress and its values of, let's say, science and freedom and equality. So this desire to reshape society and to reshape the Islamic religion really begins with the policies of the Tanzimat era in the mid-19th century. So Tanzimat era is like 1839 to 1876, and it is associated with figures like Sultan Abdul Majid and Ahmed Kibdat Pasha. What they start doing is they start saying, we're going to abolish, like, let's say, Islamic hudud laws, and we are going to do things like grant freedom of religion and religious equality to all the people in the Ottoman Empire as a way of moving closer to a liberal Western model of a state. And this becomes progressively more radical over time. So it begins in the 19th century with one change after another. Okay, we're going to remove laws which differentiate the population by religion. We're going to remove gender practices like segregation or, let's say, face veiling. So this happens kind of one thing at a time since the mid-19th century. But then by the time you get to the early 20th century, it becomes very radical. And it is in the early 20th century that you get the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire, even though it's reforming, even though it is integrating an increasingly large amount of Western cultural practices and norms, it still has a very strong Islamic identity. So the Ottoman ruler still sees himself as a Muslim caliph in charge of Muslim lands. But in the wake of World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapses. And they basically abolish the caliphate. They abolish the Sharia. This happens with the rise of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in the 1920s. So basically, between the 1920s and the 1940s, under Ataturk, they go from a situation where under the Ottomans, since the Tanzimat era, since the mid-19th century, their perspective was, let's have a society where we blend a commitment to Islam with the integration of some kind of liberal civilizational progress. Let's do that. Their goal is to balance these two goals. But with the rise of Ataturk, Ataturk says, no, we want systematic secularization, Westernization. If Islam has any role at all in our society, it just is a matter of personal belief, but we're not going to have an Islamic government. The caliphate, Ataturk says no more caliphate. It's gone. Ataturk says no more Sharia, not just no more hudud, but he even says, for instance, no more Islamic family law. Our family law is going to be exactly the same as the family law of the Europeans. So these are the kind of changes that he is making. And are there people who, so there are people in the 1920s, the 1940s, they disagree with this, and they are either executed or made to flee the country. So kind of one famous figure is executed is Iskipli Mehmed Atif, who lives 1876 to 1926. Then you have other famous figures kind of who favored the maintenance of kind of a religious Ottoman society, figures like Mustafa Sabri Effendi and Muhammad Zahid al-Kawthari. they had to flee the country. Interestingly enough, many of them fled to Egypt, where they played a role in the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood. So this is what is happening in the 1920s and the 1940s under Ataturk. In the 1950s, this secularization campaign becomes a little less repressive. So it becomes a little less repressive. It becomes a little bit more tolerant towards traditional forms of Islam. And in between the later 20s, the later portion of the 20s, the later 20th century and the early 21st century, you get increasingly positive approach to Islam. So this is associated with the AKP and Erdogan, President Erdogan. So President Erdogan is one of the things he's doing is basically, to some extent, moving the country away from the legacy of Ataturk. So this is one of the reasons it's impossible to understand the political significance of Erdogan. Sometimes people will say, "Oh, Erdogan, didn't establish Islamic law or an Islamic state." That's fine, but one of the things that Erdogan was trying to do is step by step counter and remove a lot of these repressive secularization policies. So policies that, for instance, we can't build a mosque here, we need to limit the number of mosques, or women can't wear veils at a university, this kind of stuff. Erdogan has been moving the country in a different direction. So the history of these policies under Ataturk is very much tied to the educational institution. So under Ataturk, between 1924 and 1938, all of Turkey's Islamic educational institutions were shut down. So basic schools like kutabs, to secondary schools, primary and secondary education, all the way to advanced madrasas, all of it was shut down under Ataturk. And they were all replaced by secular Western schools. And this is how major institutions like Suleymaniye and Samaniya pass away. So today, if you go to Istanbul, you can see all these big, beautiful buildings. And they were hubs of Islamic education. The Turkish government could have preserved them, and they would have been like if they had done that, they would have had a reputation like Al Azhar or a reputation like Qarawiyyin. But the government said that's not what we want. We don't want that kind of religious influence in our society, so we will just eliminate these institutions. So this is how these institutions die off. And yeah, they remain in the sense of architecture, but the educational significance has died off. And instead, what the Turkish government does is they say, even though we are going to eliminate all of the different institutions of religious education, it would be impractical to think that we can completely get rid of Islam, and maybe we don't 100% want to completely get rid of Islam. The population isn't going to accept it. So we will go ahead and allow a very small number of institutions to function, educational institutions of higher education, Islamic higher education to function. And in these institutions, we want them to teach a version of Islam that legitimates the policies of the Turkish state, that legitimates Ataturk. So we want so we're going to let a small number of institutions function, but what they need to teach is that Islam accepts the abolition of the caliphate. It accepts a secular state. It accepts the abolition of the Sharia, not only the hudud, not only the commercial transactions and the bans on, let's say, riba. Islam accepts the abolition of family law, so polygamy and inheritance, all of that stuff being abolished. Okay, we want to teach that that is acceptable. And even we want to teach that it is acceptable to alter the rituals in certain ways. So one of the things that Ataturk wanted to do is, in addition to making his country more, pushing it more in line with the Western secular model, he also wanted to cultivate a very strong form of Turkish nationalism. And he thought that Muslim rituals should be shaped accordingly. So one of the ideas shared by Ataturk and Ziya Gökalp was that the adhan needs to be changed into Turkish. Like, okay, if people give the adhan, it's legally required to give it in Turkish. And even there were people who said that the prayer, so they actually did this. This was actually a rule that was passed under Ataturk. And they even had the idea of changing the actual prayers, the 5 daily prayers, into Turkish. That was seen as too radical. Ultimately, that wasn't accepted, although this was something that they discussed. But these different changes to the Islamic religion were sanctioned and justified by the small number of religious figures that were able to teach. So overall, they shut down all the higher educational institutions, but they allowed certain places to function. So one of the places that they allowed to function for a brief period of time was at Istanbul University, which was at that time called Darul Funun. So it was allowed to function as an Islamic institute, developing some of these ideas to legitimate the Turkish state, but it was shut down in 1933. And then by 1938, there are literally no educational institutions in Turkey that are offering religious instruction. But around the 1950s, after the death of Ataturk, these policies loosened to some extent. So in 1951, they start reopening institutions of Islamic secondary education, like high schools. These high schools are known as Imam Khatib schools, and they've proliferated since the 1950s. But beyond that, and more relevant to our
I had
own,
a,
go ahead.
I have a question. Sorry, just a small question, and that is that how was all of this received kind of by the population? Because these are major and very huge changes. Especially for example, like the Azan example you gave. How much pressure is I guess you can say how much is this being imposed on the people, and why? I guess a question that would come to somebody's mind would be, what was the pushback?
Yeah,
Was there pushback,
yeah,
and
so
how
there was
was
a
that?
no. I mean, these are countries under Ataturk. There's not like freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom to vote for whoever you want. I mean, it is a strong authoritarian society. It's similar to Iran under Reza Shah Pahlavi. What this is happening at about the same time.
Mm,
They are just saying things like, not only are we abolishing the Sharia, but we're going to abolish traditional Islamic clothing. So, for instance, Ataturk said you're not allowed to wear a turban anymore. You have to wear like a Western style hat. Yeah, an example. People who didn't
mm,
agree, especially religious scholars or political figures, were simply executed or forced to flee the country. So we're not talking about
mm.
this happening in a situation where people have a free speech or the right to vote. We're talking about kind of an authoritarian regime, although this is not such a strange thing because all of the Muslim world at this time in the 1920s, the 1930s is dominated by authoritarian regimes. Most of them are the colonial regimes. So the British don't give people, Muslims who are living under them in Egypt or India or Pakistan, they don't say, okay, everyone has the right to free speech and the right to vote and the right of association and forming political parties, because they know that if they allowed the people to do this, they would vote for, okay, go away British, or we want to, reinstitute certain forms of Islamic norms. So what Ataturk is really doing is his policies are similar to the colonial policies. Now, the colonial empire, some of them are more repressive than others. The British actually, even though they're quite repressive compared to the other empires, it's less. The most repressive are the French and the Russians, and then after them, the Dutch, and then after them, the British. That is why the lands which are dominated by the British to this day usually have stronger forms of Islamic identity, whereas those that are dominated by the Russians and the French really have lower levels of religiosity. They were able to root out Islamic institutions through authoritarian measures to a greater extent. Um, uh, so so they start, but in the 1950s, after the passing away of Ataturk, they start they move away from like the very strict secularization. So they say, okay, we can have some institutions of Islamic learning. So they open up the Imam Khatib schools for secondary education. And in 1949, they open up what is probably the most important Turkish institution of religious education in the modern period, which is Ankara University, or more specifically, a divinity faculty at Ankara University. So in Turkey, one of the things that we find is they do not establish Islamic universities. They don't establish Islamic universities. Rather, what they do is they have Western universities, full secular Western universities, but they have one faculty that is devoted to Islamic studies. And this is known as the divinity faculty. So the first of these is the divinity faculty at Ankara University, established in 1949. It has a special place, and it starts influencing all of the other divinity faculties. Now, it's significant that it's at Ankara University because Ankara becomes the new capital of Turkey under Ataturk. They say Istanbul is too Islamic. Istanbul has all of these, mosques and stuff from the past. We need to build like a new, more secular city, and this is what we're going to develop in Ankara. And we're going to have the new system of Islamic education. It is going to be based not at Suleimani or Samani or even close to those things. No, we want it at Ankara University. So this is why they established this faculty of divinity at this overall secular university called Ankara University. Now, then after that, all of the different Turkish, kind of state-run Turkish universities start getting a religious studies faculty. Many of the people who join this divinity faculty are graduates of the Imam Khatib schools. So Marmara University has a well-known divinity faculty that was established in 1959. Istanbul has one that was established in 1992. If you go to Turkey today, these faculties are still there. Also, in the 1950s, they start giving the faculty members a little bit more freedom to articulate more conservative forms of Islam. So are they willing to tolerate people who are like, let's establish an Islamic state in Sharia? No, they're not. They say that's too far. We don't want faculty members saying that. That is still kind of off the table. But in terms of faculty members saying, do we really want to do things like change the prayers into Turkish? Okay, even if we don't apply Islamic law, we should still have beards, or women should still have veils. After the 1950s, there's more room for people like that. Whereas before, if you have views like that, you're seen as kind of an enemy of this state. Okay. One of the interesting features of Turkish institutions, so these divinity faculties, is they start integrating Western Orientalist approaches to a large extent, including kind of very critical or very radical Western ideas. So among Turkish scholars, the kind of Turkish scholars that are teaching and writing and are associated with these divinity faculties, they, will, like many scholars in other parts of the Muslim world, they reject the notion of taqlid. So they say, I'm not bound by the rulings of the Hanafi legal school. I'm not bound by the doctrines of the Maturidi theological school. But they go much, much further than that. Under Western Orientalist influence, which is skeptical of the Hadith corpus, of the authenticity of the Hadith corpus, basically, over the course of the 20th century, you have at these divinity faculties, you have people rejecting many hadiths or even all hadiths. So Turkey becomes one of the centers of Quranism. So I'm not sure if you've heard of the Quranist movement before, but Quranism is a tendency that characterizes many Muslim societies since the 19th century. It's a minority stream within Islam, but kind of the two most important centers of Quranism are South Asia, where you have kind of a Quranist movement in the late 19th century, and also Turkey. And then even those Muslims who aren't full Quranist, many of them would say, "Oh, we reject most hadith. We reject very many hadith." Now, beyond, oh, go ahead.
I had one question. Last question. So, one of the points you made, just kind of backtracking a little bit, you mentioned that a lot of these, in these faculties, these divinity faculties at these various universities, they are basically students that have come up from the Imam Hatib schools. How connected were the Imam Hatib schools to the old system of, Islamic scholarship and traditional teaching? Was there what was was there a connection there, or was this something that was fully, started by the new
I mean, there
government
was
and
some kind
authorities?
of connection there, and in order to speak more authoritatively, I would need to look into it in more depth. It's been a while since I've read up on these schools, but my understanding, but they are kind of, whereas traditional Ottoman schools wouldn't have given a lot of attention to, let's say, Western subjects, Imam Khatib schools are still. Uh, have a lot of, they integrate Western subjects. So they're integrating things like mathematics and biology and, these different fields. They're integrating that as well as along with the Islamic subjects. And moreover, they're not allowed, especially if we want to talk about the beginning of these schools, they're not allowed to teach a version of Islam that says, oh, we need a khilafah, oh, we need the Sharia. This is seen as like off the table, because if you start teaching that, this is basically you're
Mm.
teaching a revolution against the Turkish government.
Yeah, you're undermining the current. So yeah, I just wanted to, because it's important, because now we're talking about, sort of these radical changes being made, ideas of, like, this Quranicism, which is Quranism. But in order for that to happen, there had to be a break with the sort of traditional understanding and the traditional scholarship. So I guess that middle point was those
Yeah,
Imam
so if you're
Hatib
talking about
schools.
the traditional
So that's why I
Turkish
was trying.
madrasa is saying Khilafah is part of Islam, Sharia is part of Islam, commercial laws ban on riba is part of Islam, um, whatever family law is part of Islam. This is seen as a subversive political doctrine. So if you're at an Imam
Yeah.
Khatib school, you can still do things like learn the Quran. You can still learn things like Islamic rituals. You can still learn things like Maturidite Aqidah. But in terms of teaching people
Hmm.
kind of the more political doctrines, this is seen as going too far. Um,
Going too far.
so not only do you have a situation where these Turkish scholars will say, okay, many of these hadith are not authentic. Many hadith that have traditionally been accepted by Muslims are not authentic. Maybe all of them aren't authentic, and we're kind of full blown Quranists. I'm not saying that's the majority. I'm not saying the majority are full blown Quranists. No, that's a minority, but it is there. It does reflect something about the broader system or the tolerance of these kind of radical reformations of the Islamic canon. But even the text that they do accept. So when you have these Turkish scholars, they'll say, okay, we accept the Quran and we at least accept some hadith. Most of them will say, well, we at least accept some hadith. Even then, they're very much inclined towards radical reinterpretation. And one of the things that they use is, and this is a great book. This is actually this is a book no one is reading for whatever reason. It's not a very famous book from what I can tell, but it is. I read this. This is a book published in 2021, and I was very, very impressed by it. I thought this is a fantastic work that should be getting more attention, because it really helps us understand the development of Turkish thought, especially these Turkish universities over the course of the 20th century. And it examines some of the most radical strains of this thought. Uh,
By the way, and sorry, just if you could go back to the book. The name of the book, in case somebody's just listening to the podcast, is Contemporary Rationalist Islam in Turkey, a religious opposition to
yeah, so
Sunni
I'm not
revival.
saying, oh,
Yeah.
buy this book. It's these ideas, you should accept them. No, but I'm saying if you.
No, no, I understand. I was just saying the title out in case somebody's just curious, like, oh, what book is he talking about? By
Yeah.
Gokhan.
Yeah. So
Pachic,
what
I
I'd
don't know how
say is
you
if
say
you
that.
want to
Mhm.
understand how radical these ideas are, it's because sometimes someone might say, yeah,
Yeah.
Azhar is kind of radical. Azhar is these Azhari scholars like Muhammad Abdu or Mahmoud Shaltut are, coming up with a lot of new interpretations. Okay, that's fine. But you start reading this and you're like, whoa, these guys, these are on a completely new level. And part of it is because they're sponsored and
Yeah.
cultivated by a government that does want to radically break with the past. Um, so one of the
It just gives you a
yeah
sense of spectrum.
yeah so one of the most interesting and influential trends that is associated with these divinity faculties is a form of thought, is like a school of thought known as historicism. So historicists embrace a particular theory that has influenced not just Islam, but many other religious traditions. So you can find this approach within Judaism and Christianity. You can find it within Hinduism, but it's a particular way of interpreting Islamic text, which is often known as the theory of accommodation or accommodationism. And the theory of accommodation or accommodationism basically can be explained as follows. It assumes that any society has particular beliefs, has particular norms due to its level of technology, due to its level of scientific knowledge, due to its economic institutions, and due to the local culture that has grown up in this area. And it also assumes that people in any society will refuse to give up. If you ask them to completely give up all of their beliefs and all of their norms, they will refuse to do it. They will rebel, they won't pay attention. So the most that you can do if you want to change the people in any society is you can't just say completely give up all your most sacred beliefs, completely give up all your norms. The most you can do is modify them to an extent and push the people in a certain direction. But you can't do a complete modification of everything, otherwise, they won't listen. And this is, in fact, according to the theory of accommodation, what religious figures do, whether we're talking about Jesus or Moses or Buddha or Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They want to actually impact their society, and that means what they do is they modify the beliefs and the norms found in this society. They don't completely abolish them, even if they don't believe in them. So let's say, for instance, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu. On this theory, the Prophet ﷺ might have believed in Darwinian evolution. Maybe he believed in Darwinian evolution or some kind of philosophical or scientific theory. But if he just told this to the 7th century Arabs, they would say, "What are you even talking about? We don't agree with this." So in order to appeal to them, he basically said, okay, I agree. I'm not saying that there was Darwinian evolution. I'm saying that humans were created, but who are they created by? They were created by Allah, and they were created by Allah for this sake. And then Prophet Muhammad SAW added in some new concepts. Oh, God created mankind to worship him, to practice tawheed and whatnot. So uh, uh, the idea is that Prophet Muhammad SAW takes their beliefs about human beings as somehow created by the gods and then molds them in a way to convey maybe the message of Tawheed and the importance of worshiping only one God. So God designed human beings with a fitrah to worship this one God. But Muhammad SAW says all of this despite the fact that he doesn't really believe that God created mankind, let's say, from clay. No. Maybe he believes in Darwinian evolution, but he just can't tell people that. Or to give another example, maybe the Prophet ﷺ was a feminist. Maybe he believed in equal rights and obligations for the sexes. He wanted monogamy. He didn't believe in polygamy. But the problem is that the Arabs of this time have a very patriarchal society. Maybe they say that there's no limit on the number of wives that you can have. So what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam does, and they also say, okay, not only is there no limit on the number of wives you can have, but also women shouldn't get any inheritance at all. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is a feminist. He wants there to be monogamy. He doesn't want there to be polygamy. He also believes that male and female inheritance share should be the same. Unfortunately, the people around him aren't willing to accept it. So what he does instead is he says, instead of infinite wives, I'm capping it at 4. And also, instead of no inheritance for daughters, we give them a half share. So he's moving the people in the direction of gender equality, but he's not able to realize it. So people who use this accommodation theory, when this is what's characteristic of the historicist school, they basically say that the Prophet Prophet's message is like a modern liberal message which agrees with science and secularism and feminism and individual freedom and everything else. But the people of his time just weren't ready to hear it. But when the Prophet ﷺ allowed, some kind of polygamy or made some kind of concessions about believing in creationism as opposed to Darwinian evolution, it's not because the Prophet ﷺ actually believed that Muslims have to accept these beliefs or rules. He just made a temporary concession to accommodate the people. And in a more civilized society, you don't have to have these things. So, for instance, another idea would be, I mean, I could give you some other examples, but I mean, you can really take this in a radical direction, and these Turkish thinkers do this. So, like the center of the historicist movement is the divinity faculty at Ankara University, and leading historicists include figures like İlhami Güler, Omar Ozsoy, and Mustafa Öztürk. But they will say things like, the Quran, the text of the Quran is not really the Quran is not really a revelation from God. So it's, in one sense, it's an eternal revelation from God. But the Prophet ﷺ basically put it in terms he basically molded it to fit to appeal to Arabs of the 7th century and their culture. So you can't look at it as a divine text. Rather, it's a general divine message that the Prophet ﷺ kind of molded so that it would be acceptable to the Arabs of his day. And in fact, according to these Turkish thinkers, the Arabs of the 7th century were very backwards. Not only backwards in comparison to our own era, but even backwards for the time. So, for instance, the Arabs were not as advanced civilizationally in terms of science and everything else as the Sasanians or the Byzantines. So the Prophet ﷺ really had to accept a lot of backwards, undesirable Arab norms that shouldn't be retained, but that were just done to appeal to the people around him. And this is why they will describe this as an area of jahiliyyah. Like the 7th century Arabs were so jahil and so bad. This is why there are certain undesirable customs and beliefs that have been preserved in the Quran. So, to give you an example, you might say that the Arabs in the 7th century, they believed in prophets. So they had been exposed to Christianity, they had been exposed to Judaism, and they had come to believe, like the Arabs had come to believe, that they were actually descended from the prophet Abraham. Okay, this was a belief in 7th century Arabia. Now, these historicists will say, okay, this is a cultural belief. In fact, it's a type of mythology. There was no such thing as Abraham. There was no such person as Moses. They never existed. But these were beliefs that had spread among the Arabs. So the Prophet ﷺ, in order to teach them Tawheed, worship of the one God, he said, okay, yeah, there was a guy named Abraham, and he believed in Tawheed. So follow Tawheed because it is the creed of your father Abraham. But in reality, belief in Abraham is simply mythology, and we can in fact dispense with that. Or we could say that, for instance, slavery and jihad conquest and amputation of the hands for theft, these were all Arab practices. they were due to their culture, they were due to the specific social circumstances of 7th century Arabia, but ultimately, none of these are actually part of Islam, and they're not ideal doctrines, and they should be abolished. And the Prophet ﷺ only allowed, so for instance, the Arabs wanted to conquer each other and, conquer and win political power. So the Prophet ﷺ said, I can't stop you from doing that. But all I'll do is I'll change your war doctrine and say, okay, if you're going to conquer people, do it to encourage them to adopt Islam. So if they don't adopt Islam, give a jizya to them or impose a jizya. So in that way, the Prophet ﷺ wasn't in favor of imperial conquest or imperial warfare, like imperial jihad. Rather, this was simply a concession to the culture of the Arabs. So you might say, well, if you have that perspective, aren't you basically opening the door to abolishing almost all Islamic beliefs and norms? And they will say, yeah, no problem. So,
Yeah, that's kind of, I wanted to actually bring that point up because a lot of people will have this sort of attitude when you tell them some parts about Islam that maybe they don't agree with for whatever reason. They'll say, "Yeah, that was around that time," and they'll restrict it, or explain it away in these sort of hypotheticals. But I think this idea of accommodation, it's sort of its basis, and maybe critiques of it are also important for Muslims to understand as well. Because sometimes they'll hear it and they'll be like, well, that's actually a good explanation, man. Like, it seems like, that's what happened. But when you start going into the details, it falls apart, right? These are very broad sort of generalizations that these historians are making. But when it's actually studied, and I think that's how Muslim scholars a lot of the times they'll pick a particular issue and say, okay, let's get into it and see if this generalization is okay. And when they look at the particulars, you realize that in
I
fact
mean,
it's not. I don't know if you have
no,
anything
I
to add
agree
to
with
that sort of
you. I think
that discussion.
accommodation is more maybe convincing if you look at it as one issue, but if you systematically apply the principle of accommodation, it eliminates all of the norms and all of the beliefs of Islam. So, to give you an example, someone can
Mm.
say, during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the way that people expressed their love of God was through multiple prayers. So the Christians had a number of prayers per day. The Jews had a number of prayers per day. So for that reason, because the people were used to expressing their devotion to God in terms of a number of daily prayers and also in terms of fasting, the Christians and the Jews had fasts. Like the Jews would fast on Yom Kippur. The Christians would fast Lent. So for that reason, because people express their devotion to God in this particular way, this is how they express their love for God. The Prophet Muhammad SAW said, "Okay, you can have a 5 daily prayers as well. We'll have our own distinct 5 daily prayers, and we'll have our own month to fast. That's the month of Ramadan, because this is the cultural norm." But there's nothing, we don't need to keep but that's just simply an accommodation, a concession to the notion of religiosity, to the practices, to the way that they expressed love in 7th century Arabia. But in a different era where people can express love in different ways by writing poetry or maybe just doing dhikr, we don't need the 5 daily prayers, and we don't need Ramadan either. That's just, a temporary thing. Even the notion of Allah. But what is the notion of Allah? Allah is an Arabian concept. Even before the coming of Islam, there was a God worshipped at the Kaaba. The Kaaba was seen as the Bayt of Allah. But in reality, the true reality is not Allah. The true reality is just some simple higher power. Maybe you call it Jesus if you're a Christian. Maybe you call it Allah if you're a Muslim. Maybe you call it Brahman if you're a Hindu. That's fine. These are all specific names. And yes, in an Arabian context, you needed to believe in a deity named Allah that sits on a throne and that has a hand and that has an eye and that has a shin. Okay, that's fine. But the only reason why the Prophet what the Prophet wanted to do is simply turn people to focus their lives not on this world, but on this higher power. And in Arabian context, that was the notion of a god that resembles a king. Okay, fine. But if you once you realize that, you will see that's the belief in Allah is simply an accommodation to the beliefs of the 7th century Arabs. And if you want to say, I reject Allah, I only believe in a higher, it's kind of some abstract philosophical higher power like the Neoplatonic one or like Hindu Brahman, yeah, no problem. So in this way, people so one of the things that's interesting about historicists is they do systematically apply the principles in this direction, and this is why it becomes so radical. And anyone who said, oh, no, okay, I find accommodation compelling when it comes to slavery or when it comes to belief in Abraham or whatever, I accept accommodation for that. The question would be, if you accept it for that, why don't you accept it for all things? Like, what is a slippery slope? Where do you draw the line? In fact, this is arbitrary. Either you apply it systematically, and in that case, all of Islamic beliefs and all of Islamic norms are essentially explained away as concessions to 7th century Arabians, or you say, no, I'm not going to apply it at all. And that's more of a principled stance, but it means that you can't just pick and choose where to use it, because then it becomes like a pure matter, it becomes purely arbitrary rather than methodologically principled.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that point is important for Muslims to understand, that it's very arbitrary. Like, you could basically explain away the whole of the religion in this way, and that's why they shouldn't fall into that trap of, kind of uh, sort of bringing up these ideas and holding on to them as a, because then the idea comes about, having a principle stance and applying it right across. And if you do that, you end up explaining away the
Yeah,
whole of
so
the
I mean,
religion
this is
itself.
this is why I hope you now have a sense of why, when I'm talking about these Turkic populations being exposed to very radical forms of Islamic thought. This is what I mean. So maybe
Yeah.
before, if you're thinking, oh, the radical reformist forms of thought are what we encounter, like Wasatiyya type thought in Al Azhar, oh, that's pretty radical according to maybe in comparison with traditional perspectives. This is, we're at a new level. Like, this is what we find among these Turkic populations is a quite a step beyond. Um, Okay, so that's just a taste. If you want to read more, read that book that we saw earlier, which is a Contemporary Rationalist uh, Islam in Turkey, and you will see how far how far it is taken. Okay, moving to Central Asia. So Central Asia, historically the most important educational institutions in Central Asia before the modern period, they're in a number of different countries, but they're really concentrated in Uzbekistan. So Uzbekistan has a city of Samarkand, a Samarkand, very important city. It has like one of the most perhaps the most famous, at least architecturally, madrasas in the area. There's a square called Registan Square that has 3 different madrasas: the Ulugh Beg Madrasa, the Tilyakori Madrasa, and the Sheridor Madrasa. This is kind of, anyone who reads about Uzbekistan and its history, this is considered one of their most important cultural monuments. So these giant, beautifully decorated madrasas. You also have the Kokeldash Madrasa in Tashkent. But if we were going to talk about what is the most important madrasa, what is the most important institution of higher Islamic learning in Central Asia right before the modern period, it is located in the city of Bukhara. So Bukhara has a madrasa known as Miri Arab Madrasa. So this is kind of what it looks like, is what Miri Arab Madrasa looks like. As we will see, this is kind of the one madrasa that the Soviet authorities allowed to operate. So it's kind of the only madrasa from the pre-modern period that has been able to operate without interruption to this day. So it's still there today. It's still functioning today. But this is like the one madrasa in Central Asia of this kind. all the Soviets shut down otherwise.
Is there a reason why they allowed this one, or
Well,
they
the
didn't
Soviets
impede?
kind of I'll explain in a moment, but they flirted with the idea of just complete atheism, forcing it on everyone, but there was too much of a backlash, not only from Muslims, but from Christians. And they also thought, okay, it can be useful to us if we educate a class of religious scholars that will religiously legitimate Soviet policy. So very similar to the Turkish government under Ataturk. They said we want to produce certain religious scholars that say Islam is consistent with Ataturk's Western secularism. And the Soviet government says the same thing, just like the Chinese government. The Chinese government also runs Islamic schools. To this day, they run Islamic schools. They say, we want you to have we're okay with having, we don't want a lot of Islamic madrasas. We don't want too many Muslim scholars running around. They could cause a problem. But we could have like a one or two madrasas. And what they will be used to is to teach religious scholars that Russian communism or Chinese communism is the true message of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or is this consistent with that message?
And it's also kind of why they clamped down on
Yeah,
people
under
who
the
study
Soviets,
abroad.
they do not allow people to study abroad. They say no one is allowed to study
Yeah.
abroad. You can't seek religious knowledge generally because there aren't enough madrasas to really give people access to religious knowledge. And only people who can study religion are those that are studying in these very tightly monitored Soviet institutions like Miri Arab Madrasa. Oh,
Yeah, there's an aspect of that persists even till nowadays. I remember we had a few students with us from these sort of from that region, and even when they would go back, they would be under a lot of, they would be kind of depressed, and they would be really worried going back, and worried about being exposed as having studied Islam in a traditional
yeah, I
madrasa.
mean, these policies, so we're talking about them as early 20th century policies, but to a large extent, they persist to this day, to different degrees in different places. But we're not just talking about ancient history with no relevance to today. There are parallels. In many cases, quite strong parallels. Okay, so if we want to talk about Central Asia, we have to talk about Central Asia as part of a more broad, like the history of religious education in Central Asia is really tied to the history of Muslim populations under the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Empire. So the Soviet Empire is controlling Central Asia. It's also controlling Muslims within the borders of modern day Russia and the Caucasus. These Muslims are predominantly Turkic Muslims, and there are these reform movements like you find in other parts of the Muslim world. You have in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you have the emergence of reform movements, and what they do is they say we're going to combine Islamic tradition with the liberal idea of civilizational progress. We just need to figure out how to bring these two forms of thought together. So, in a Russian ruled context, this movement is known as Jadidism. Jadidism. So, some of the most important figures in Jadidism are Muslims born in Russia, like Zainullah Rasulov, who lives 1833 to 1917, Ismail Gasprinsky, who lives 1851 to 1914. He's actually the most important person. If we were going to talk about the most important Muslims in kind of Russia and Central Asia, if you had to give one name, a lot of people would say it's Ismail Kasprinsky. He lived in Crimea. Another example is Musa Bigayev. He lived 1870 to 1949. You also have some very influential figures from Uzbekistan who support these ideas, these Jadidist ideas. So you have Mahmoud Khoja Bahboudi, Munawar Qari, and Abdurrauf Fitrat. They are. So on the one hand, what distinguishes them What distinguishes Jadidism as a movement? So in one sense, Jadidism as a movement is just exactly what you find in other places, like let's say Egypt or the Arab world, where they're like, okay, we're going to mix Islamic tradition and the liberal ideal of civilizational progress. But it has two unique features. Jadidism has two unique features. Number one, they're more radical in the sense that they are willing to reform and change or reinterpret a larger number of Islamic teachings than the Arabs are. That's one difference. Another difference is it's mixed with pan-Turkic nationalism. So a lot of them are adopt an ideal of pan-Turkism. That doesn't mean that they're not Muslims, but for them, their Islamic identity and their Turkic identity come together. So it's like a Turkic. So Jadidists are Turkic nationalists in addition to Islamic reformists. And they spread these ideas just like the Arabs have a journal called El Manar, where they're spreading their reformist ideas, like Rashid Rida. There's a journal published by Ismail Gasprinsky known as Turjuman, that is published and is spreading these reformist Jadidist ideas among Turkic populations in Eurasia. So in these Turkic Muslims in Central Asia and in Russia have to face. They're all under the rule of Russian communism. And in the 1920s and the 1930s, they start facing very, very severe secularization policies. The Russian government says, we're not going to allow you to interact with other Muslims. We're basically going to bar everyone from making Hajj. In the 1920s and the 1930s, they basically closed down all the mosques, almost all the mosques and almost all the madrasas. They also have a campaign where they force women to take off their veils at this period. This is a very famous campaign. It's called the Hujum campaign. They say all these Muslim women need to take off their veils. This is also the era in which you have Stalinism, and episode in Stalinism is known as the Great Terror, in which they kill tens of thousands of Muslim religious authorities. They're not just doing this to Muslims, they're doing this to Christians as well. So Stalin is trying to destroy Christianity as well. But in addition to that, he's trying to destroy Islam because he wants to make the Soviet Republic kind of a scientific atheist society. So many people are actually, all of these members of the Jadidist movement, many of the leading figures in the Jadidist movement, like Munawwar Qari or Abdur Rauf Fitrat, they're killed in the Stalinist Great Terror. And others will flee abroad. So many of them will flee to, let's say, Turkey. They'll go to Turkey. Just like when people are fleeing Ataturk, they go to Egypt. When people are fleeing the Russians, they go to Turkey. But between the 1940s and the 1980s, Soviet policies become less severe. So the Soviet Russian state continues to maintain strict control over a religion, but they're no longer mass killing religious authorities. They do allow certain institutions of education to operate and certain religious authorities to operate under tight state control. Key figures are Ishan Babakan, who lives 1858 to 1957, Gabdrahman Rasulev, 1889 to 1950, Ziadin Babakan, who lives 1908 to 1982, and then you have Talgat Tadzuddin. He's still a Russian authority to this day. But this is a great example of how the state basically has religious scholars and says to these scholars that your primary aim is to legitimate state policy. So your goal is to produce a version of Islam that legitimates Soviet communist policies. And many of their ideas are influenced by Jadidism, but the primary issue with them is not so much intellectual consistency. It's just basically whatever is necessary to justify the Russian government. And they start, coming up with some interesting fatwas. So, like one of the things the Soviet government wants to do is to ensure maximum economic productivity, but economic productivity to this day, I mean, this has been studied by economists. Economic productivity in the Muslim world declines during Ramadan, declines substantially. People are tired, people are fasting, people are maybe sleeping at odd hours. So the Russian authorities recognized this, and they basically said, okay, I want you to give a fatwa. I want you religious scholars that are working, being paid by the Russian government, I want you to give a fatwa that in Ramadan, anyone who is doing physical labor no longer needs to fast, for instance. This is a fatwa they have. If this sounds like kind of a very radical fatwa, I mean, you do have fatwas like this in some of the more secular Arab countries. So Habib Bourguiba, who was kind of like the authoritarian ruler of Tunisia in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. Do you know who this Habib Bourguiba is? It's like a
No,
very
actually, I've
interesting figure. So he's
never
the
heard of him.
president of Tunisia and also considers himself a master mujtahid. He has the same argument, except he actually goes further. He doesn't just say, "Oh, Ramadan isn't fasting isn't necessary if you're doing physical labor." He just says Ramadan fasting isn't necessary at all, and then he basically goes into the public and he starts drinking orange juice. So this is kind of like a famous episode of in the history of government-sponsored religious reform. The Soviets, all the Muslim lands. So under the Soviets are governing Muslims in Crimea. They're governing Muslims in the Caucasus, like Azerbaijan, Dagestan. They're governing Muslims in the Volga, Ural regions. They're governing Muslims all throughout Central Asia. They say all of these different Muslims, they're only able to study at two places. One is the Bukhara's Miri Arab Madrasa, and the other is Tashkent's Imam Bukhari Islamic Institute. So Bukhara and Tashkent are both two cities in Uzbekistan. So they say all the Muslims under Russian rule, under Soviet communist rule, can only study in two places. All of the other dozens or hundreds of madrasas and religious educational institutions, all of them are destroyed. All the other ones are intentionally destroyed by the Soviets. So if you're wondering, why is Central Asia not an important hub of Islamic religious education, Islamic religious scholarship? It's because literally the Soviets destroyed every single madrasa except for these two madrasas, and these two madrasas, Bukhari's Miri Arab Madrasa that I showed you earlier, and then an additional institution known as the Imam Bukhari Institute in Tashkent. These were literally the only two places that were allowed to operate. They had a limited number of students. All of the students were closely monitored by state security officials. They were given tasks to do by those state security officials. And the people trained here. So, for instance, if you're living in the Caucasus, if you're living in the Volga Ural region and you want any kind of Islamic education, you have to go all the way to Uzbekistan to get it. And you can only go there with the agreement of the authorities. So in the 1980s and the 1990s, things start changing because communism weakens and then collapses. So the communist system collapses throughout Soviet Russia. They say, okay, we're no longer going to have a communist system, and then they give at least nominal independence to many countries, not all. Many are still living in Russia to this day. Like, let's say, Chechnya would be an example. So they don't give like independence to Chechnya, but other places like Azerbaijan, like Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, these places were ruled. The Central Asian area was ruled by Russia. and with the fall of communism, they give all of these countries their independence. So in the 1980s and the 1990s, after the fall of communism, you get the elimination of these very, very strong repressive policies, and you get the beginnings of a religious revival across Central Asia. But here there are limitations. So number one, the fact that you've had by this time, 7 decades of hardcore communist rule has really succeeded very effectively in secularizing the population. So we're talking about the least religious Muslims on earth. And that's not something, they won't automatically become committed Muslims just simply because you remove the secularization or you remove the repressive policy. Some will, but most will not. Beyond that, even after the fall of the Soviets, the successor regime, so the successor regimes in Uzbekistan and, Turkmenistan and Kyrgyzstan, many of them, even though the state has independence and even though they're not as repressive when it comes to religious matters, they still continue on with some of the Soviet policies. So they still believe in controlling quite tightly Islamic religious life, because they don't want people to rise up and basically none of these governments say, oh, we're gonna accept the Khilafah, we're gonna accept Sharia. No, they don't want things to move in this direction. They don't want Islamic political parties. And for that reason, even though they're not going to be as tight in regulating mosques and madrasas and using mass surveillance and controlling religious figures, they are still going to be quite careful about exerting strong state control over the religious sphere. Today, if you were going to go to Uzbekistan, the three most important institutions that are functioning would be the Miri Arab Madrasa. So that's the madrasa that functioned throughout the Soviet era. Although this isn't necessarily the most important, because it's, from what I can tell, and there's limited information available, it has quite a small number of students. But in addition to that, you have the Tashkent Islamic Institute. Remember, that was established in 1971 under the Soviets. And then you have more recently Tashkent Islamic University that was established in 1999. So these are kind of three important centers of higher religious education in Uzbekistan, and by extension, all of Muslim Central Asia. So here's, like, if you want to see a picture of Tashkent Islamic Institute, this is kind of what it looks like. Here are some slides. This is kind of one of the famous Soviet authorities talking about the importance of knowledge. Here you have even this Tashkent Islamic Institute. We're still not talking about like tens of thousands of people or even thousands of people. We're talking about, 650, because one of the things that these governments do is, even if they allow Islamic education, they make sure to limit the number of madrasas or Islamic universities. They want to keep the number low, and then also the enrollments within any institution quite low. So this is something that characterizes Central Asian religious life until this day. And the kind of radical ideas that you find among the historicists, that you find among Turkey, comparable ideas are found among these in a Central Asian context.
And I believe so in these countries, in order to be an imam or khatib, you'd have to particularly be from
Yeah,
one of
so
these institutions.
one of the things that you have in Central Asia is they don't say anyone who wants to be an imam can be an imam. Anyone who wants to run a mosque can run a mosque. They have rules that say, okay, you can only form a religious organization. So one of the things that they do is they will say anyone can. We believe in freedom to form religious organizations to establish mosques. We agree with that. You just have to get state approval first. But then they will say, oh, we're not going to approve many people. So maybe people put in applications to establish 1,000 mosques, and we only accept 10 applications. And then those applications are conditioned, like, okay, You want to establish 1,000 mosques and establish 1,000 Islamic schools, we'll let you do 10. And those who are these 10 have to be run by credentialed religious authorities, which means authorities that have graduated from our institutions. Otherwise, as for someone who was educated abroad, as for someone who's like a self-educated, we don't accept them to run a Islamic charity or mosque or school. It's not something that we want to deal with.
Interesting. Is
Yeah,
that
that's pretty
the
much the
last
last
slide,
slide.
or is there more? Okay. Well, Jazakumullah khairan. I hope everybody enjoyed this episode pertaining to the transformation in Islamic education throughout Turkey and Central Asia. Again, Jazakallah khair to our guest for giving us this overview, which was thorough and deep and broad all at the same time. Inshallah, we hope you stay tuned for our next episode, inshallah, on the transformation in Islamic education. Do like and subscribe the video, share it with others as well. And inshallah, we hope to have everyone back for the next episode. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.